Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your presentations last night. That was really, really helpful for me to understand where all of you are coming from. My background in college was actually anthropology, so it was kind of cool to go back to the days of not investigative reporting, but I studied interviewing methods and ethnography, and my focus in college was actually the H1B visa. Show of hands, who knows what that is? Okay, cool. Which is the low-wage, low-skilled temporary visa. So this is on the H1B visa. Show of hands, who knows what that is? Okay, a few more.
All the people who are on them.
Great. So we're going to talk about H1Bs, sexism. It's going to be a fun morning, or as Jeff calls women, those with gender. So those with gender will be discussed today. I just want to have a warning, all right? It won't be white men today. So to jump right in, we're going to show you a little bit about how we came about this topic. This is ongoing. So the first brief was published last month, which you should have, and then the second brief will come out shortly, and then there may be one after that. So what I'm going to cover today is essentially how we got to the first two briefs out of this study. So we're kind of coming off the helm of two different kinds of headlines. The first, Natalia's anxious to see the first one, which is Leaders Urge for High-Skill Immigration Reform. We read Techies Cry for More H1Bs. High-tech immigrants are crucial to local economies. And then on the flip side, we see other headlines in this space, which are technology's man problem, why the tech industry hates feminists, and my personal favorite, sexist, nerdy regime is killing tech industry. Yikes. So we kind of see that there are two groups creating tension, right, in the space. Everyone's getting a shout out today, ladies and gentlemen. So we kind of wanted to enter in and explore this technology industry through the lens of the H1B, which is a temporary visa for high-skilled, highly trained immigrants that lasts for 3 years. Is anyone actually on an H1B? All right. That can be extended up to 6 years. So you have to have a bachelor's degree unless you're a model or someone else in the entertainment industry. And workers right now can currently bring their spouses, but they're currently not allowed to work legally. So they can get an education, they're allowed to vote, but they don't have authorization to work in the United States. They can vote in local elections. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But like other immigration issues, the H1B is politicized and contested. So to explore that a little bit, I want you to listen to this NPR 3-minute segment for what the two sides of the debate are, and then we're going to talk about a little bit how both might be just a touch flawed.
With immigration reform a non-starter in Congress, those advocating reform have been urging the Obama administration to make changes on its own. And the first of those changes was announced this week. It involves the guest visa program known as H1B that allows highly skilled professionals from other countries to come to work in the U.S. The change would allow nearly 100,000 spouses of H1B visa holders to work as well. NPR's Kelly McEvers has the story.
Back in India, Priyanka Moray got a management degree and an MBA. She eventually landed a job managing the sales staff of a German jewelry company.
3,000 staff was working under me. You can say hardcore sales. I was working Monday to Saturday nonstop.
Then, late last year, Moray got married to a guy who does IT work for a healthcare consulting firm here in the U.S. He's on an H1B visa. When Moray came to join him here in January, she realized she wasn't allowed to work unless a company would sponsor her.
It was really difficult to just sit idle and doing nothing and watching TV or resting for an entire day and cooking or cleaning the house.
Moray couldn't sleep at night. Her doctor diagnosed her with depression. She spent hours on the phone with her family.
And so finally it has happened that now we have taken a decision that I'll go back to India as soon as possible.
Like this Saturday, and her husband will leave in September. This is exactly what the administration doesn't want to happen with H-1B visa holders. So officials this week proposed a new rule that says spouses of H-1B visa holders who are in the process of applying for green cards can work in the U.S. too. Officials say the rule will enter a 2-month comment phase, then will go into effect soon after. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker told reporters the rule will help keep H-1B visa holders in the U.S.
These individuals are American families in waiting, many who tire of waiting for green cards to become available and leave the country to work for our competition.
Neha Maha's husband is in the process of applying for a green card. He's a Java coder. She was a TV journalist back in India. Here's what she says about the new rule.
Too good to be true, certainly, because I couldn't believe 6 years of my life I have been just waiting and waiting and waiting that something will come eventually.
Economists say for every high-tech job like Maha's husband's, other jobs like lawyers, nurses, teachers, and construction workers are created. It's known as the multiplier effect. But critics of the H-1B program say it allows American companies to attract younger, cheaper foreign workers and push qualified Americans out. That's what happened to Gene Nelson. He was a fiber optics engineer at Genuity, a spinoff of GTE. Then in 2001, he was told to train some H-1B visa holders how to do his job. A few weeks later,
brought into a room with a few of my peers, and we were all told you no longer had a position with Genuity.
Nelson now teaches physics at a community college. Despite its critics, immigration analysts like lawyer Eli Cantor told me the new rule for H-1B spouses was the least controversial. Of all the reforms for the administration to take up on its own, in lieu of a bill being passed by Congress, how would you characterize this?
Very minimal. Very minimal, and it's trying to ameliorate the problem on the margins.
Cantor says the original program would have applied to all H-1B spouses, not just the ones of people already in the process of getting citizenship. But even that proposal, he says, was watered down. Kelly McEvers, NPR News.
All right, so what do we think? What were the two sides of the debate? What do the characters represent? Which one's right, if any? Any ideas? Yeah.
The TV journalists from India should just go back to India. Don't wait for anything to happen here, because even with their paperwork, you know, it's a bleak job market. There's probably a lot more opportunities for her in India than there are here.
Okay, so in that answer I heard the woman was one character.
Well, she was the one journalist.
One journalist.
So you're
right.
showing your bias in it, but she was the one journalist was the key differentiation.
Right.
If it was a man who was a journalist who had a wife here working, I would have said the
there
same
are
thing.
plenty of high-tech jobs in India too, I would imagine, right?
Yeah. So we have I know, but so which is worse, cooking and cleaning all day or unemployment?
Oh, I have to rest. But that is part of the problem, is like people hear a story about this, Americans who are looking for jobs and maybe stressed out all day, and then they hear someone complaining that she has to stay home and rest. You know, what's that?
All right. Any other ideas? Any other things that jumped out at you that you thought that's kind of silly? Yeah.
I was wondering, couldn't the couple apply for H1B separately because they are both professionals?
So that's a great question. Essentially, right now, you have to have a company sponsor you to get an H-1B. You can't apply yourself to the Labor Department and be like, I promise I'm going to find a job. They don't believe you. Well, it's not that they don't believe you. That's just not how the law works right now. So a spouse would have to come on his or her own H-1B visa through her own company sponsorship. But I just thought it was interesting that we see the two sides of the debate through this newest proposed policy change, which is that spouses who have H-1B husbands or wives, I don't think it applies to domestic partners, who are in the process of applying for a green card. So we see that, innovation and the multiplier effect can only occur through these H1Bs, right? Like innovation can't come from anyone else, so we need more H1Bs. We need these spouses to be working so they're not cleaning and cooking. But then on the other hand, we see that when we're talking about Americans being displaced, the reporter didn't even refer to them as H1Bs anymore. She referred to them as foreign, right? Like foreigners. So we see in just 3 minutes how we're kind of pitting the immigrant high-skilled worker versus the American worker who's just trying to keep his or her job alive, right? So he doesn't have to go teach physics because obviously that's the worst profession. Yeah, Paulina.
And this other side of how H1B displays, I mean, it was dramatic in this one. Like he actually had to, he was told to train these people, and then he was told, we don't longer need you because you don't train them. Now, I have no doubt that happens, but none of that had anything to do with anybody's spouses.
Right.
In that particular. With or without the spouses.
Right.
His situation would be exactly the same.
Absolutely. He'd still be teaching physics, poor guy. Yeah.
And it's still the same number of H1Bs, regardless of whether you let their spouses work. You're just adding those 100,000 spouses. That's a teensy drop in the bucket of the labor market. Also, the example of the fiber optic engineer losing his job in 2001 is pretty terrible. That's when the telecom bubble collapsed.
Right.
And engineers were out of work all over the place. And so that was a structural issue.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So a lot of problems with the story, but it's a good example of a lot of stories that are covering this issue, not just the spouse issue, but anytime there's someone covering H1B. I mean, not every time, obviously. A lot of ones that I've read kind of pit these two groups against one another as if there can only be one group or the other to spur innovation, that there can only be one group or the other to work in these high-skilled industries. Did you want to add anything, Amy?
Yeah, I just recognize a bit of a different perspective on it because being based in India is a really huge and important issue.
Yeah.
So usually it's the companies who are complaining that they can't get enough. It's a quota system, so there's only a limited number of these. And the companies are often the ones who are complaining that they can't get enough skilled workers because they don't have enough visas to access.
Right.
So from their perspective, they're being cramped.
Yeah.
It's not that American workers are being displaced, they just can't hire enough people because there aren't enough even skilled workers here who can do that work.
Absolutely, and that is the other side of the debate that wasn't reflected in the story, but you're absolutely right. I would say that on a more broad scale, and this is exactly what the project gets into, is that companies say we need more workers, there is a shortage, there is a skill gap, there aren't enough Americans to fill the jobs. And then on the other hand, you have American labor interests and other researchers who say, no, there are Americans to fill the jobs, you're just not choosing to hire them. You're purposefully not hiring them. And if you are hiring them, you're paying them less. So that's essentially why we wanted to look at it, right? Because there are so many different sides to the story, but it is very emotional. It's very contested, and at the same time, serious economic issues remain because these companies are saying, we have a problem. This year on April 1st, the application process usually opens, and by April 7th, that 65,000 visa cap was met. So 172,000 petitions were filed in that first week, which is enormous, right? Meanwhile, we see that even through this debate, this politicized debate, there is still some sort of labor market distortion here that we wanted to dive into a little bit more in depth. So AIER's goal in general, and my goal in particular, is not to suggest policy change, but rather just to see what businesses can do to address their either real or perceived labor shortage problems. So I mentioned
to be sure, there's not a shortage of unemployed Americans.
Right. Well, that's something that we're looking into, because you can see, one set of data on unemployment rates, and both sides argue opposite things, right, with the same kind of set of data. And that's what we found with with literature on the skills gap, on labor shortage, and on wages. So there hasn't really been a consensus in terms of research, applied research, and policy research in this space. So we see singular sets of data, and some use it to say there is a skills gap, meaning there is a lack of Americans who are studying and graduating with STEM degrees and are willing and able to take these jobs. And then on the other side, there are people who use the same data to argue the opposite. The same with labor shortage. With wages, essentially we have two groups. One is arguing that H-1Bs drive down wages because companies use them as kind of vulnerable or flexible labor that they can pay less to, and that drags down the prevailing wage for everyone in the field. And then there are a couple other more recent studies that have found that H-1Bs are actually paid more. So we're trying to essentially weigh in on these three areas through a basic demographic study that looks at those industries that really have a high demand for H-1Bs to see what the distribution is from H-1B to US citizen worker, what the educational attainment differences are, and how those wages vary. So I'll talk a little bit about history of H-1B policy. Just so you get a sense of where it came from and where this kind of myth of the two groups and the two debates came from. Then I'll explain how I did the demographic study, and then we'll get into the results. So I'll talk about distribution in education, wages, and then I'll show just one regression table to see what extent wages are correlated, H-1Bs are correlated with higher or lower wages. So if y'all know a lot about immigration history, I won't go through, any of this. Anyone like, I already got the history of US immigration. Okay, cool. So essentially, up until 1965, the US was like a little bit racist. They were like, we don't really want to let in anybody. And then in 1965, they said, our bad, we'll let in Europeans. Because at the time, Europeans were not deemed white. They were not deemed American. So they set a quota for family members already in the US. Their other family members in Europe could come. But at that time, employment, what was that?
Cubans.
That was later. that was a little later, but yeah.
We embrace Cubans.
Yeah, well, we embrace immigrants not like Americans in times of crisis, and then we send them back.
when they reject communism and we're fighting against communism.
Exactly, but once they're no longer a communist, you can go home. But that's separate. But the proportion of employment-based immigration was slim. And so essentially from the 60s up until today, it's a similar trend that we want high-skilled immigrants, but we don't want that many, and we don't want them to interfere with American labor interests. So at this time, the first set of employment-based visas had to already get approval by the Secretary of Labor. They could only work in jobs where the supply was considered inadequate, and they could not adversely affect US wages. So then in 1976, the proportion actually drops of employment-based visas, and at this time we see a major demographic shift from Europeans to Latin Americans and Asians. So slowly the US is also decreasing its quota-based race and ethnic-based immigration system. So in 1990, we really see the first formal H-1B system come about. So this was really in response to the 60s and 70s, where the immigration policy was really about family reunification. And this was trying to cater to those labor interests that argued, hey, we really have a need for H-1B visas. And this was largely, not surprisingly, in the computer technology industry. So this is what first set that cap of 65,000. At this time, workers were limited to work 6 years. They had to have a bachelor's degree. And employers had to pay them the prevailing wage or the average wage of all wages in that field. So in the mid-'80s up until 1996, there was a huge demand for labor. That resulted in a lot of unauthorized migration, largely from Central America and the Caribbean at the time. So in 1986 and then again in 1996, there was kind of a pushback for immigration that was based on illegal or unauthorized migration, but that also affected H-1Bs. So here we wanted companies to pay H-1Bs more. We wanted harsher penalties for companies who were shown to essentially displace U.S. workers or not hire U.S. workers first.
But paying them more was an incentive not to do it, is that?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So in 1997, not surprisingly, after this first act that was a pushback, we heard a spark of shortages, right? So in 1997, that cap was reached for the first time. So from 1990 to 1997, the demand wasn't actually that high. So in this time, the computer industry used this information to say, look, there's an unmet demand. We need more high-skilled foreign-born workers. And so at this time, we also see that this is debatable. The fact that there is a shortage is debatable. So the Commerce Department made a study, and they said, actually, there are shortages in the computer technology industry. The Government Accountability Office read that study and said, actually, that is totally flawed. Your findings are inaccurate. But we see, for the first time, this kind of debate between the shortage issue really come to fruition. So in 1998, the US raises the cap to 115,000, and they were supposed to peter it out over the next few years. But essentially what ended up happening was the Labor Department kind of overshot the number of visas they issued in the first place. So they had a de facto cap of 195,000 from 2000 to 2004. And then it was dropped again to 65,000. So the dotted blue line is the cap where it was set. So this is that 115,000. And then the single blue line is the demand. So here is where we see it really spark or increase above the cap in 1997. And then we obviously won't get into this, but these are the low-wage, low-skilled visa numbers. Any questions on like cap history, visa policy history? Cool.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
What is the disclosure requirement? Because in listening to this segment, it sounds like people get here and then they're surprised. So like,
about their spouses?
I come here and I find out that, yeah, my husband got a job here, but I can't get a job here.
It's very strange.
Is that a surprise to
Yeah.
them? What's that?
Very strange.
It's
Very
strange.
strange that they're surprised?
Yeah, I mean, there's the company bringing the guy over has a lawyer, should be able to tell him and her.
But does the company has an interest in getting that worker here?
Yeah.
So the company may have an interest
Yeah.
in snowing that part over. And oh yeah, and there's just, don't worry about that. It's fine.
Yeah.
So what, it sounds like is it the company's responsibility to make the disclosures?
That's a really good question.
And so then they have that inherent conflict that they want to attract a worker and they don't want to disclose any pitfalls.
You've got to be like pretty ignorant if you don't realize that your spouse can't work.
That's actually, it's actually not that cut and dry. So a few years ago, as I said, I focused on the H1B visa, which is low-skilled, low-wage work. And there was a same thing where recruiters would actually promise H1B workers in largely Guatemala and India all of these things. You're going to get a green card, you're going to get $20,000, your spouse is going to get to work, we're going to send your kids to school. None of these things are true.
We're counting on the wrong people to communicate
well,
to the recipient.
I think
what
it's
they'll get once they get here.
I think it's too black and white to say one way or the other. You know, it is the company's responsibility, but we don't know. The companies usually work with recruiting companies who work with local recruiting companies who work with local recruiters.
So they dislocate themselves from any accountability for the predicaments that these people end up in once they get here.
I don't want to say they. Like, I think that
whether it's deliberate or not, that
right.
is the effect.
We don't know.
Kind of
we don't know. Because I mean, there isn't that. So in the H1B visa, there's a huge effect of illusory promises, of workers organizing, saying we were promised these things, we didn't get them. There hasn't been that much with H1B workers, so we don't know to what extent they're fed any kind of false promises.
And it could be misrepresentations within the couple.
Right.
That might have all been disclosed to the husband, and he's like, fuck it, I want the job. And I will tell her.
And then maybe, let's say, one, let's, Paulina, really quickly, and then we'll wrap up this debate.
Not from from
for now.
Statistical data or anything, but H1Bs are educated people, and all of them speak English. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting a job.
Right.
But that information is not hidden. If you want to know, you know that your spouse is not allowed to work. What people might be surprised about is different things. How difficult it is to actually be out of work. One thing I think is when this one of the women who was saying is like she got depressed or whatever. Another thing that you might think in the back of your head, yeah, I can't work right now, but I'll find I'll find a job, I'll find a way to get a job some other way once we get there. What they don't realize is how Byzantine the American immigration system is, that the second option is virtually impossible.
Yeah, so it's definitely, more complicated than like, oh, the companies are feeding these, lies, and then the poor worker is like disenfranchised. There's a lot going on, and we don't know necessarily all of the ins and outs, but it's fascinating. So in the purpose of getting to actually like some results, I'll just say that we use data from the American Community Survey, which is from the census, and essentially these variables are pretty standard dependent variables. The one thing I will say is that H1B I created a proxy for using two variables. So I combined born outside of the United States or foreign born with someone answering non-US citizen. So right now the census understandably doesn't ask about legal status. They're not like, hey, are you illegal? No worries, for obvious reasons, right? So this does have its limitations. It does overstate the share of H1Bs in these industries, but the characteristics are actually pretty standard, comparing them to other data sets that do ask about H1B status. So first I'll talk about demographics, and then later, as I said, I'll go into wages and the regression. So the top 10 industries that requested H1B visas in 2013 are these right here. So 71% of them are in the computer technology industry, not surprising, and then 6%, or the next largest share, is in finance. So what I did for the next set of analyses was I combined all of the computer technology jobs and all of the finance jobs into two comparison groups. So the other, 30-something% are completely varied. There's not really a trend that like they're all economists. It's pretty diverse. So there is a higher share of H1B visa holders in computer technology jobs than in finance. Again, not all that surprising since demand is lower. I do want to say, point out the caveat one more time that these shares are higher than they should be because of that proxy variable. But we can see about plus or minus a few percentage points that H1Bs make up 13% of the computer technology industry, not the computer technology industry as a whole, just these top jobs that are demanding H1Bs. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we want to break down gender in the two industries, technology and financial occupations. So we can see that the spread is pretty even in finance. There's actually a slight majority of female to male. And in the computer technology industry, it's a little bit more pronounced. By a little, I mean like a lot. So there's 26% female to 74% male. And we can see that disparity is greater among H1B workers to US citizen workers. In finance, it's not, not too much of a difference, but it jumps to 22 to 78 female to male ratio, which is pretty significant for demographic data. So now we're going to look at educational attainment differences between financial occupations and computer technology occupations. And we're going to compare US citizen and H1B or foreign-born non-US citizen to male and female. So H1B male and females have pretty comparable levels of educational attainment or high educational attainment. So 91% of males have their college degrees or higher, which is very significant. And 84%, slightly lower, of H1B females have their BAs or higher. But there's actually, interestingly, a pretty big difference of educational attainment between US males and US females. And that's pretty different from the computer technology industry, where the educational attainment of US males and US females is pretty similar, right? They're both lower, obviously, than H1B males and females, which are at 94 and 93%. But they...
They're required to have BAs in order to get visa.
What was that?
Who make up the rest if they're required to have BAs to get visa?
That's a good question. That's a problem with the variable. But, and it's also a problem with any kind of survey-based data. So there's another data set I'm working on now that actually asks if you're H1B. And some of them respond that they're unemployed. Some of them respond that they have their associates. So I think any time that you're self-reporting anything, there's going to be inaccuracies, right? But one thing that struck out to us when writing the first brief was why is gender distribution so skewed in the tech industry? One, educational attainment is so similar. So 68% of men and 67% of women have their BAs and higher, yet we see that the large majority of computer tech workers are US citizen males. So that was one thing that kind of stuck out to us that we definitely don't have the answer to. And the other was, with educational attainment so comparable from technology to finance among US citizen women, why are there US women employed to such a lesser extent in the computer technology industry? So these are questions that are ongoing. At the end, hopefully we'll have time to discuss them and get your take on them, because this is something I'll continue to dive deeper in the educational side in the future. So to look at wages, how are we on time? 5 minutes till 10 minutes. 5 minutes till 10 minutes, great. Okay, so first we're going to look at average wages, and then I'll show you the regression. So this is just, I don't know if you can see this, but this is comparing those top 10, or it's 9 occupations with how many visas were requested and their average wages. So they really vary quite a bit between the the mid-50s all the way up to 100,000 for financial analysts. So like if ever we want to quit our jobs, maybe we should be financial analysts, you know? So we can see in finance, US citizen males earn the highest amount, about 89,000 on average. This is not breaking out anything. This is not comparing educational attainment, age, anything. This is just a complete aggregate look on average. And the lowest mean salary is 55,000. So then, when breaking out high levels of educational attainment, we really start to get a sense of the wage disparity in the finance occupations. Again, despite such similar levels of educational attainment, at least among US males to H1B males and females. So essentially, this shows that there's a 45% difference between US citizen males and females with a college degree. So that's how you read the chart. So there is a largest among H1B males and females, which I thought was really interesting because, H1B females have, I forget what it was, like 85% have a BA or higher, and yet they are the lowest, even breaking out that high level of education. So at more than college, the salary among H1B females is only $64,000 compared to H1B males, which is $100,000, which, is all opinions and emotions about it aside, it's huge. just from a strict data perspective, this is huge. Yeah, so these are just those 3 to 4 finance jobs that were requesting H1B visas. So something that Marcia and a few others asked me is like, well, what about, maybe it's because women in these finance jobs are actually maybe clerical workers and they're just checking off that they're the high-skilled finance job. Again, any problem with survey data, that might be the case. But I don't think it would be the case with like all of them. And so these are the women and men who checked off that they were one of those 3 high-skilled occupations. So either management analysts, financial analysts, or accountants. Those are the occupations we looked at.
I think the way to rephrase that question is, what if the company hired you and they call you financial analyst? What would you actually do with Xerox papers?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm being less politically correct than you are in your question.
No, I'm not asking that.
What
I'm assuming that they're not going to bring in an immigrant to Xerox papers. Like,
right.
It's probably not worth the H1B application if they're that hard to get.
That's I think that's accurate. It could be. I don't know. The extent to which that happens for U.S. females, but it's definitely possible. I mean, anything's possible. But that's why I think this data is so interesting, because we can interpret it a lot of different ways. And that's why it's problematic, because a lot of organizations have interpreted it in any way that makes their point.
Did you have to look at what the ranges are within those two? I just wonder if there's a couple of like really rich dudes that are here making like millions.
Absolutely. So with microdata, you can drill down to the individual observation. So I kicked out those like major outliers who are like, really, you're making $7 million? You maybe wrote it down wrong. So I kicked those people out. Maybe they didn't.
Like the US citizens in the category, do you only include everyone, like with different level of work experience? But for H1 for H1 holders, they can only have H1B visa for less than 6 years. So they have less work experience. Maybe that's why their average salary is lower.
Well, among men, though, it's pretty comparable. And the one thing so when we get to the regression, we'll kind of control for years of experience on the job. But you're right, this doesn't do that. Although presumably, even though you're only in the US for 6 years, you have studied or worked in that field in your home country for longer than that, depending on the field, which is more true for finance jobs than for computer tech workers.
H1B holders, they got education in the US after they graduated.
So there are additional. I skipped that. Sorry. So there are additional H1B slots allocated for those workers who studied in the U.S. So if you got your PhD in the U.S., you have a higher chance of getting an H1B visa with a company, because there are 20,000 visas just for you. So you can essentially start in that pool, and then if you miss the cut, or if the company applies too late, you can then move into that other category. But yeah, all of these questions are definitely valid. And I'll just look at educational attainment. So this is the tech industry. We can see that the percent differences are smaller, but still significant. So even though it seems on the most aggregate level or most average level that H1B males earn the highest, regardless of educational attainment, years of experience, et cetera, when you break out educational attainment, US citizen males still earn more. So this is another thing that stuck out to me as really fascinating, because in these finance jobs, we see more women than men at a smaller proportion, 55-45. And yet we see such large differences between salaries, right? Whereas in the tech industry, we do see high levels of educational attainment among US men and women. And the salaries are definitely different, but not as different as in finance. So now I'm going to show you, I took out a couple of variables in this table, just so that it was a little bit easier to read. But I'm going to show you to what extent H1B status is correlated with higher or lower wages. So this essentially shows, here is the constant at about $65,000. So without controlling for anything, anyone in these top 10 jobs makes about that much. So then when you start adding in the other variables, these coefficients show what on average, in comparison to the constant, that worker is going to make. So I'll start with the most, to me, interesting finding, which is US citizen and foreign born. These are these two variables that I use to create H1B, the proxy. So these two variables, sorry, I don't have my glasses on. These two variables are actually the only ones out of all the variables that were statistically insignificant by like a huge, huge, huge margin. So that essentially shows, along with the relatively small coefficients, that they don't mean much, that they actually don't determine any kind of wage difference one way or the other, which, you know, given the limitations of this analysis, is still really significant because so many organizations, research, policy, and otherwise, are arguing that they drive up wages, that they drive down wages, and that might not actually be true. So let me go through the whole thing, and then that'll essentially be the end. So I'll open it up for questions. So then we turn to another significant finding, which is that being female, when controlling for a bunch of other variables, such as educational attainment, such as being employed versus being unemployed, the specific occupation, such as having children, such as age, earn about $26,000 less than males. So that is a lot different than other organizations are reporting as well. I think that past analyses that I've read at least have reported differences, but not big differences. This is like a big difference, so it's pretty significant. Essentially, being male matters. So in order of importance, having a college degree or more matters a whole lot, right? Being employed matters a whole lot. Being in the particular job matters a whole lot. I took out the other occupations, but I put all occupations in, and they changed the wage contribution significantly. But
is employed, what does that mean exactly?
Versus being unemployed.
Like
but when you get the, so do you add the 65 to, what do you do with that $53,000?
Yeah, so essentially you could do this like a Mad Libs, you know? So you could start at the constant, and then you could be like, let's pretend I'm Hispanic. Oh, your salary drops. Let's pretend I'm white. Oh, that's better.
What do you make, so what happens to the employed category?
Your salary jumps a whole lot.
But that means so you'd be making $100,000.
Yeah, but then once you go into the specific occupations, once you go into where you live, if you live in the Northeast, Midwest, it balances out. It's not like, you know, $150,000.
How would it be possible to be H1B and also be unemployed?
That's a good question. Another reporting issue.
Okay.
That, you know, not a lot of people reported that they were unemployed. Okay. But this is just accounting for those people who say they're not in the labor force, but identify as a computer programmer, for instance.
But there are also non-H1Bs in here, so they could be unemployed.
Right, exactly. Exactly. But we see that essentially above being employed and above being employed in a specific occupation, your sex matters more than any other variable. So essentially, yeah, let me just, this is the last slide, and then we're going to open it up.
Something on the earlier slide,
yeah.
I wanted to draw your attention.
Yeah.
You captured women without children and men without children.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't capture women and men with children.
Yeah, this, great point. So these two categories are compared to women with children and men with children.
The assumption is they have them, and then you make the adjustment if they don't.
Exactly. So this is saying that actually men without children earn less than men with children, whereas, and this is not surprising, women without children earn a little bit more than women with children. So this is an attempt to control for the argument that, oh, it's not that we pay women less, it's just that they pop out kids and they don't work anymore. Well, this is saying that even women without children, on average, for the fact that they have gender, earn $26,000 less than men. Does that make sense? So just some next steps. Essentially, I'll be looking at a different survey, as I said, that delves more deeply into educational attainment called the National Survey of College Graduates. So my next steps after putting out this wages brief will be to delve a little bit more deeply into the skills gap, into the shortage issue to see, okay, how many people are graduating with these degrees, what % are women and men, what % are H1B and US citizen. So, now, any questions? I'm so good. Yeah.
And I don't even know if you can pull back that slide, the regression slide.
Yeah.
Because all the questions that I'm wondering is how further can you slice and dice the data? Because like the big things popping out at me are, could you that line item married?
Yep.
Could you separate that for men and women? Because sometimes being married really limits your mobility.
Right.
If you're the secondary earner or something, that can change very subtly. And then, you know, maybe mom had a kid and took maternity leave and something that catapults that into the higher earning potential. And so then mom is kind of latched to him in a job search, and then she has to take the job that is in the area they're in, as opposed to having that mobility and leverage to, you know what I mean? So there's, this thing has a gazillion tentacles stretching off of it.
Absolutely.
But I'm just trying to think of things other than, we're men, we're not going to share with women.
Right. Definitely.
At play, and even with like the line items for race, accounting for income levels and poverty. Just how long did it take them to achieve that credential or degree? You know what I mean? Like it can just take them a longer time, so they're just a little bit behind in earning.
Yeah.
So I didn't, but particularly on the marriage one, I didn't know if you could separate that by gender.
You can. And I did. It was about the same.
Yeah.
So that's why I just kind of collapsed it into one group. But you're absolutely right that there are so many things. I mean, there are so many things I can do with this data set, so many variables I could pull that so if you could think of any, please let me know, that I haven't thought of yet. But also, there are so many things that aren't captured in a survey that are important.
The more you slice it, the less reliable it is.
Well, right, that too.
Thousands of people, right? Observation.
You have, there are like 7,000.
Oh, so you have some space.
Yeah.
For slicing it.
Yes.
So your main point, you did this whole regression to figure out whether it matters if you're H1B or not H1B for the wage. And the answer is basically no.
Right.
Because the two things that have to do with you being H1B are the only two things that don't matter in this whole list.
Yeah.
Well, that would be, on some level, that would be a confirmation that the policy is more or less works as expected. The wages that companies can pay to H1Bs are not whatever company decides. You need to do labor certifications for Labor Department to show that you pay their prevailing wage. You don't pay your H1Bs any different than you would Americans. This is not something you do in 5 minutes, like stacks of papers go with this sort of thing.
Right.
And this in the law. So the Labor Department has to make sure the H1B wages are not too different. They seem to be not too different. So I think this is not a bug, it's a feature.
Right.
It was designed this way. And it seems to be more or less working this way.
Yeah.
If you're a woman.
The Labor Department is not taxed with the task of making sure the women are paid the prevailing wage. When you hire a woman, you don't have to apply for Labor Department to show you pay her the prevailing wage.
Yeah, so a couple of things, and then we'll go to each of you, are that one, women do make up such a small share of not only workers in the tech industry in general, but also of H1B workers, right? So, there are a lot of observations in this data set, but that could be at least controlling some small part of it that maybe it's not entirely accurate. One thing that you said, Paulina, that about that maybe it's working as it's intended is it might be interesting to, so the H2B visa, there are a lot more arguments that companies, even though they're supposed to in the same way be providing the prevailing wage, there's a lot more anecdotal evidence that they're not. So what might be interesting is even just kind of a check to this data to see, okay, let's look at the top 10 highly demanded H2B jobs, right, which is like meat packing, forest pining, non-agricultural low-wage jobs, and see, okay, what are the wages compared to in that instance? Because if they're the same or if they're insignificant, then it could mean that there's a problem with the data, which is good to know. But it could also mean that maybe the anecdotal evidence isn't exactly, generalizable to the overall population. So that's a really good point. Yeah.
It could still be that it's the presence of H1B visas, the option of hiring people with H1Bs is holding down the prevailing wage for everyone, right? I mean, it's an increase in supply.
Absolutely.
It would be kind of strange if it didn't.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that would be when you just show, well, you showed us mean average wages, but you probably could do the median or some other percentile stuff. And it doesn't seem, at least for the males, that there's a huge difference between Americans and H1B.
Absolutely.
They seem to be paid fairly the same thing.
Absolutely.
You know, that's it.
Amy?
Just wanted to know how this compares with just wages in the tech industry in general. I'm sure women are probably paid less. So is it consistent with those general trends?
It is, but not to the extent that I found. So there was an article I read, I think yesterday actually, that said, and I didn't trace it back, so I have no idea the reliability of what it was reporting, but it said that it was like 89 cents to the dollar in the tech industry in general. Now, what jobs that included, I don't know. And what methods they use to get that, I don't know either. But it is a good point that these 6 jobs are not all jobs in the tech industry, and they're certainly not all high-skilled jobs in the tech industry. So that would be a potentially fruitful next step. Thank you. Yeah.
I was just wondering, it kind of goes back to the radio piece we were listening to, but it sounds like some of the way that some of these workers are treated is like, well, they're going to be the future U.S. citizens. Do you have a sense of how many people that come on these visas get to stay?
That's a really good question. There is such, and if either of you let me know, there's such a huge backlog of H1Bs that qualify for a green card. There's such a huge backlog of people in that pipeline that I don't know that I have an accurate number right now. Do you have a sense of what the percentage is of H1B and a green card?
Well, actually, that brings another part. I'm going to try to partly answer. I don't have a number. I'm not going to give you a number. Well, first of all, green card is not a system, and we know for a fact that a good chunk of people who get a green card never get around to get citizenship.
Right.
Not because they didn't get around it, but they don't want it, for whatever reason. I mean, we're talking, I think it's probably like 50-50. I mean, the reasons could be like if you're Mexican and you take American citizenship, you have to give up the Mexican one, and then you can no longer own land in Mexico, and you don't want to do this because it's your parents' house or something.
Right.
I mean, there's a number of reasons, so just don't assume automatically green card means you're going to be citizen. I think it's like 50 or 60, 40 or something like that we actually do. But we're talking about H1Bs to green cards transition. And this is what I was surprised when I started hearing listening to the radio piece. They said that we're talking about 100,000 of spouses of H1Bs are going to get a right to work. And I'm thinking, there are millions of H1Bs in the country at every one point.
Right.
Why are we talking about 100,000 spouses? Would the rest of them are not married? What? And then finally, when they got to a point of saying that the law only going to allow those spouses of those H1Bs who are in the process of getting a green card to work, that's 100,000. Well, it's not 100,000. Some of those are also not married. But the point is, so at some point in your H1B life, you get the right to apply for citizenship. Between the point where you get the right and you apply, and the time you get this citizenship, might be years. And I'm not saying 2, I'm saying 6, 8. It depends on a whole lot of things. The job, the country you're from. There's no logic to this, basically. All through this period, you work and all that. You're not kicked out of the country. But it's this, the time that it takes to transition from H1B to green card is not short. How many of them actually do it? I don't know. My guess is pretty much a lot of people, because by the time you are towards the end of your H1B, you've been in this country upwards of 10 years. You probably gotten your education here. You spend the 6 years in H1B. If you didn't like it, you'd be out of here. So, but that's, I can't give you a date.
Yeah.
I've been in that
because
pipeline.
there is a wait list for green cards to happen, I'm assuming there are lots of people waiting.
I've been in that pipeline for employment-based green cards, and it is interminable, and the terms are pretty rough, actually, because they only extend the H1B 1 year at a time. So if you leave the U.S. for any reason, to then return to the U.S. in legal status, you have to return to the U.S. Embassy in your home country, renew your visa, and then come back to the U.S. So forget about any vacations in the Caribbean or whatever. You have to just keep going back to your home country once a year, and that's pretty much all you can do. And it's it's a burden for your sponsoring company to renew your visa every year. By comparison, getting a green card because you marry an American is instant.
Right.
So it's
There's
still
a
there's
provisional period, but
there's still this huge bias towards
210.
family-based immigration and against employment-based immigration.
That's another thing that I think would be fascinating to look into more, even from like a historical, sociological, social policy perspective, is like why is there and what does it mean that there's this preference for family reunification instead of employment-based, especially considering that, you know, in 2007 and onward up until 2011, there were huge amounts of deportations, right? There was family separation from Latin American, Central American, Caribbean, Asian countries. And then there was another backlash, right? We have to reunify the family. So, you know, that's more like a kind of rhetorical study, but I think that's really interesting. Do we have time for more? Yeah. All right.
I'm interested to hear what the other badges think, because when we heard the clip and then we have the conversation here, I think it underscores a problem in journalism about finding anecdotes that fit the narrative.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how it was very emotional and stuff, and it stirred things, reactions from everyone in the room.
Yeah.
And so I can't help but, I want to know so much more information about each of those people that they interviewed. You know, like what kind of situation did they leave in India, you know, for them in particular, and how is that our problem now? Like, you left this here, and were you in the dark, and did you not realize this? And then for the American worker, like the typical story of the American worker building his own guillotine, you know, and training the foreign worker that's going to take his job. And like Peter mentioned, how many of those foreign workers that he hired were laid off too? You know, and so there are all these missing elements there, but instead it's like these little snippets that fit the narrative that will enrage, you know, that will stir emotions, as opposed to finding anecdotes that fit the data. You know? So that was my takeaway from listening to the segment.
I just want to say, I want all of your opinions on this, because especially last night hearing, you know, how to find anecdotes and coming from more ethnographic work, it was imperative that I not cherry pick my stories, right? Because then that's not valid qualitative research. But when you have 3 minutes to report a story, right? Obviously, you're not. Maybe you are. Maybe you're not. I mean, I want your all's opinions on this. But that's why I think it's so cool that we get to be here and discuss this. You know, because turning to demographic data, I don't get to see this side of it. But I think that this side is so important because this is what people are reading. They're not reading that. You know, they're listening to NPR. So yeah, I open it to maybe Amy, and then
just my response, like just radio. I'm a print reporter, I'm a writer, but I've been taking some radio classes at the J School, and just the constraints with radio are really different than print. So like a 3-minute radio story, you really can't say much, and then there's a lot of emphasis on how how the quote sounds. You know, we don't have to like worry so much about whether the person telling you the quote sounds dramatic or sounds interesting. And there's a lot of emphasis on that in radio. And someone who just sounds boring but actually has something substantive to say might not make it into a radio story. So it's kind of weird, actually. And I've pitched some stories to my radio teachers, and they're like, nah, that's too complicated. And I've written like articles about that, and they're like, no, it doesn't work for radio. Okay.
Kind of like the temp agency thing, right? It's like, that's fascinating. And we actually have talked about doing temp agency work. Like research on kind of digging into this a little bit. But it's like, if you have, if there are too many sides to the story, if it's too complex, it's cut. But obviously, you know, it's important to bring that information to the public. So how do we do it? How do you do it? Did you want to add anything?
Just a different question. I don't have any conviction that this is actually the case, but you would be able to explain the gender differences you're seeing. Excuse me, you're seeing in pay if, for example, say engineers coming out of the Indian educational system. If, for example, the Indian educational system were, say, more stacked against women than our own is, even if they are coming out with the same titles, you might have people who have been heavily privileged or underprivileged, depending on gender, who are looking for jobs, and then you could theoretically displace the culpability for the disparity onto the yeah. But again, I'm not in any way suggesting that I think that is, just that it seems like it would be one credible explanation at least for why women were earning less on H1Bs.
This is capturing the U.S. women too, right?
Mm-hmm. But this disparity with the U.S. women was there, but not as big.
There's no meaningful. There's not a difference. Not real.
But there is the same argument. Companies make that same argument about U.S. educational institutions. Right. It's not our fault, you know. They're like discouraged from getting these degrees, and then when they get them, they're not taught how to advocate for salaries. So they didn't ask. It's not, you know, it's not our fault. So that is a, you know, an argument that we've heard before, and so that's why, you know, I'm interested in delving into the kind of education side.
Okay, so maybe last question.
Any final thought?
I have to commend you on what you're doing, because two things that always explode with ideas that we know of is a discussion about immigration and gender difference. Every time you print something like this, you know, and you put both of them in the same place. It's just, you know.
This is going to be like the cat picture of the
Thank you.